Okay, peeps, welcome back. So today we're going to be going over what to expect over the next 3 months for LTCN and BCHG. Let's get it. So the first thing I want to bring up here is actually not LTCN. So we're going to bring up instead the chart of Bitcoin. Why does this matter? Well, you're going to find out in a minute. So take a look at the chart of Bitcoin. And actually, I think I'm going to have to go back to the monthly for this one to really be able to see this. So here it is. Just so you all know, the halving is what we're going to talk about right now. So the halving is actually happening this month. If we take a look at the pullback on Bitcoin, you can see it's pretty sharp. So as of right now, roughly about 17% from the wick high up there. So one of the ways that we can gauge what's going to happen over the next 3 months with both LTCN and BCHG is by taking a look at what happens at the time of the halving and also after the halving. So let's go ahead and take a look at that now. We are on the monthly time frame, just so you all know. So we will go down to the weekly time frame and look at this, but we're going to start with the monthly. So each one of these vertical white lines here, that you can see 3 on the left. These were the previous 3 halvings to the exact week. Those are the week of the halvings, and we're going to take a look at those and see what happens. So each of these vertical lines is basically the halving week of previous cycles. Now, what happens before the halving? So basically the 3 months before the halving, we get some kind of sell-off. We haven't seen that this time around. Again, not every cycle is going to be the same, but there probably are going to be some similarities. So the month of the halving, the price went up. We're not seeing that this month. This month, which is the month of the halving this month, we are seeing the price go down. But then again, Bitcoin back here was not at all-time highs. Bitcoin right now is just coming off all-time highs, so there's a bit of a discrepancy there. But the 3 months following the Bitcoin halving, we generally saw basically a month of selling, as you guys can see here, and then 2 months of going up. So if we measure this basically from the top to the bottom of that month, you're talking about roughly about a 15% correction. And then from the opening of the following monthly candle to the top of the next month's candle top, you're looking at about 38% on that move to the upside. So now let's go back a little bit in time here. Let's take a look at the previous halving cycle and see what that one shows us. So again, a little bit different here. The 3 months leading up to the halving was actually up, as you guys can see. This was in 2016, so this was the week of the halving, or I should say the month of the halving. So the month of the halving, we did have a little bit of red, and then the following month was red, and then the third month was a little bit green after that, although not really that green, to be completely honest. So from basically the halving month to the bottom of the following month was about a 33% drop. And then from the bottom of that wick low to basically the wick high, the following month was about a 32% increase. So it stayed relatively flat during this time frame. It kind of just moved sideways. Didn't really go up, didn't really go down. So now we're going to go back to the 2013 halving. This is the very first halving in Bitcoin's existence. It's actually really hard to see because Bitcoin was basically pennies back then. Man, just imagine buying Bitcoin all the way back here at $12 per Bitcoin and then still currently holding it today. How much money that would be worth if you had just bought like 1,000 Bitcoin. That's it. Yeah, that'd be a lot of money. So again, 3 months leading up to the halving, basically the general idea here is that we were going up. Month of the halving was also up, and then 3 months following that was up. But again, this was shortly after the creation of Bitcoin. So I think this chart itself is actually not even the oldest chart for Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin, if I'm not mistaken, goes back to 2009. So this is not even all the price action. This is just the very first halving. So the effect for Bitcoin to go up after the first halving was pretty immediate. The effect after the second halving was a little bit more slow paced and a little bit more even paced. And then the effect after the third halving was, you could arguably say it was pretty much on pace with the second halving, although the move up after the halving was quite a bit slower the third time around. As you can see, it wasn't pushing up as hard as the second halving. So now this month would be the halving month. So what do we generally see during these halvings? Usually we see, I would say more often than not, we see the price go up. Does it mean the price has to go up this time? Not necessarily. We could have a pullback. We'll go over those pullback zones here in a minute. But we're going to go down to the weekly time frame and kind of dig into this a little bit more. So this actually needs to be moved over a little bit. So this is actually the week of the halving right here. So basically, we'll just do roughly about 4 to 8 weeks going into the halving. So as you guys can see, price moved up into the halving. As we get closer to it, it's kind of starting to sell off. So potentially a buy the rumor, sell the news. But then again, the high on Bitcoin did happen just before the halvings. So if we were to have a regular cycle, I would say it's likely that we probably see a pullback and or sideways chop going into like maybe Q4 of this year, and then Q4 the price starts to move back up. And then we have the true bull run next year. I would say that's likely. There's a couple other scenarios. Either it could just chop sideways the entire time until it goes up at the end of the year, or it could just go up and then we could have a shortened cycle. I think the last scenario is probably the least likely. So we're going to go back here in time. It's going to take me a little while to actually get to this, so give me a second. Okay, so this was the 2020 halving. As you guys can see here, this was the previous cycle. We actually got into crypto the exact month of the halving. Did not know it at the time, but that's what happened. So leading into the halving, you guys can see that the price went up. Then at the time of the halving, the price was kind of just flat, and then it pretty much went sideways after that until July, and then the price moved up again. Then it went sideways and down some more, and then it moved up again. This is the reason why we're talking about this potential sideways movement here. So pretty much from just about the time of the halving to about the time that it went into the actual bull run, this thing was basically in just a big channel. So that is a possibility. Now we're going to go back even further to the 2016 halving. Okay, so here it is. This is the 2016 halving. So what did this one do? Well, this one actually looks a lot more similar to what we're experiencing right now. I would say this is probably very similar to the current cycle. So a few weeks leading up to the halving, we saw basically a pump, and then we saw a slight sell-off going into the halving, and then post-halving, of course, we saw some more sell-off. But what did we see after that? Basically, we saw pretty much just sideways chop until the end of the year. And I'm going to reiterate this one more time. So basically from the peak of that candle there to basically say the low of this one, because again, that's pretty much right around the time of the halving. So it's about 4 weeks off. We pretty much did nothing but down and or sideways until we got towards the end of the halving year. And then the price started going up after that. So a lot of confluence there. So now we're going to go ahead and take a look at the very first cycle here to see what happened on that one. Okay, so it took me a minute to get back here, but you got to understand this is years and years worth of price action. So very similar thing here, although not quite exactly the same. So instead of having a pump 8 weeks before the halving and then a dump 4 weeks into it, we got the opposite here. So we got a dump for the first 4 weeks, and then the last 4 weeks into the halving, we got a pump, and then it went up. And once again, as you guys can see, it pretty much just went sideways. It didn't really do much of anything. So the halving happened, nothing happened, and the price pretty much just chopped sideways. And then once again, as you guys can see, towards the end of the halving year, this thing did pump into the beginning of the following year, which is typically the bull run year. And albeit, I mean, the halving did happen towards November, so it happened right around the time that Bitcoin would go up in the halving year, but that is just kind of, I would say that's an anomaly for basically for the first bull run cycle. So now we're actually going to do a little bit of comparison between this and, so this and LTCN. So bear with me just a minute, guys. You got to basically wait for the charts to load here. It does take a little bit of time. So let's take a look at BTC. Okay, so we're going to go back to the previous halving, roughly around the time of the halving, and we're going to take a look at that price action on the chart here in confluence with LTCN. Okay, so just so y'all know, LTCN was not in existence around the time of the halving. The halving was back here in May. LTCN, according to this chart, and this is the only chart on TradingView that has LTCN. There's only one. There's no multiples. So according to this chart, the LTCN trust did not come into existence until basically DeFi summer of 2020. So what happened after the time of the halving exactly? Well, we don't really know because LTCN did not exist. But what happened before the end of the year, before Bitcoin was about ready to take off? Well, pretty much LTCN dropped and it kind of went down. And as you guys can see here, it did drop pretty substantially along with the drop in the price of Bitcoin. Does it mean that that has to happen this time around? Not necessarily. If we take a look at the wick high here down to the wick low, you can see the drop wasn't even that big. It was about 20% compared to the drop on LTCN was quite a bit larger. So it was about 76%. But the difference between now, or between back here and between basically where we are currently at now, is that as you guys can see, the price reached from pretty much that support that we've been talking about for eons all the way up to this resistance zone that we've been talking about. So it was pulling back from nearly $100. It was not pulling back from where it most previously had its local peak at about 54 bucks. So now let's take a look at BCHG. So we're going to look at BCHG. This one is, it looks like it came out at the same time as LTCN. So of course, very similar. Bitcoin dumped, BCHG dumped, but again, BCHG was way up here at $35. We did not get to $35 on this local peak that we had. We only got to 24. And again, that's because resistance formed after this peak here. So, price action traders, they're not looking at this price back here. They're looking at this zone right here as a potential profit target selling point, and or if they're a bear, they're looking for a short zone, and this is basically a short zone. So, or even potentially just a reversal zone. Some people, they'll just long down here and they'll say, okay, if it gets to this price, I'm just going to reverse it and short it. And they'll just keep doing that until the trade no longer is valid. And then they'll basically switch their strategy at that point. So as you guys can see on the charts, both LTCN and BCHG did pull back going into, or basically shortly after the halving, but before the end of the halving year. We're in the halving year right now. As you guys can see, 2 days until the Bitcoin halving. It's scheduled to be on the 20th. It's not exact. It's a rough estimate. So it could be the 18th, 19th, could be the 21st. We won't know until we know. Okay. So now we're going to go back forward in time a little bit here on BCHG. I got to get the chart all the way back over here. And we're also going to do the same thing for Bitcoin. Okay, so as you guys can see, Bitcoin is kind of forming a rounding top here on the weekly. This does indicate that there's a possibility that the price might pull back, and it has pulled back quite a bit, actually. And if we measure this compared to the previous dump that Bitcoin had, it's almost roughly the exact same amount, so 19%. Does it mean it's going to bounce right away? Not necessarily. We'll take a look at that in a minute. But as you guys can see, BCHG is doing something very similar with Bitcoin here. And we'll go over to BCHG again and flip this over to LTCN so you can see, again, once Bitcoin was about to top out, that's when LTCN topped out. And of course, both of them had a pullback. So what can we extrapolate from this? Well, it's pretty simple. In order for the price of LTCN and BCHG to go back up, Bitcoin has to go back up. Okay. In order for Bitcoin to go back up, it has to have the halving event. The halving event is in a couple of days. Again, Bitcoin doesn't normally start pushing to all-time highs until roughly about November of this year, is ideally when it's supposed to, based on the cycles, when it's supposed to start pushing to its all-time highs. So if that were to happen, LTCN could just, go down and maybe chop sideways a little bit. If we have some kind of accelerated cycle where, let's say, 3 months after the halving, Bitcoin goes back up, LTCN and BCHG are oscillators, they're going to go back up. And then presumably we would see a sell-off in the Bitcoin dominance, and then the Bitcoin dominance falls off a cliff. Money flows from Bitcoin into altcoins, and that's when the real true parabolic move on a lot of these grayscale trusts will come. Now, I have to be more specific about this, okay? So LTCN and BCHG are likely to top out roughly about the same time that Bitcoin tops out, or perhaps slightly before then, okay? But when Bitcoin tops out and the Bitcoin dominance falls, I do not think that these are going to push higher. They may push higher, but again, these are oscillators specifically to Bitcoin. Whereas something like Ethereum or ETH-E and ETCG, they move in correlation to each other. So the other ones that the grayscale trust that would be likely to pop off on the falling of the Bitcoin dominance, I'm going to point them out to you guys right now, would be something like HZEN, GXLM, Zcash, GSOL, Mana, GBAT. Which one was this? G-Link, PhilG, and GLIV. Those ones are all likely to rise in price when the Bitcoin dominance falls. But as Bitcoin's pushing to all-time highs after the halving, LTCN and BCHG, that's when they're likely going to have their moves. And then Ethereum, or I should say the ETCG trust, which we have, will go up as Ethereum is pushing into its all-time highs. And do keep in mind that the spot Ether ETF is potentially going to be approved next month, and that will also be after the Bitcoin halving. So it's possible too, if we were to have a left translated cycle, an accelerated cycle, it's possible that if money is about to flow shortly after the halving from Bitcoin into Ethereum and altcoins, Ethereum's price could start skyrocketing right around the same time next month that Ethereum gets its spot ETF approved, and then money would flow ideally from Bitcoin and Ethereum into the altcoins, and then we see some of these other late mover grayscale trusts move up. So kind of my thesis right now is I think that LTCN and BCHG are likely going to pull back, maybe move sideways a little bit into the end of the year. And then towards the end of the year, we're going to have a bigger move to the upside. I could be wrong about this. It could be a left translated cycle, but I'm still going to give more weight over to the traditional cycles we've seen in crypto, because we've seen it for basically as long as Bitcoin's been around, and that has not changed. So anyways, hope you all enjoyed this content. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see y'all later. Peace.